First off, a little bit about LA Makerspace. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we were funded by parents who were makers. They were members of a grown-up hackerspace called Crashspace, and as they started having kids, they realized they wanted to do making with their kids. And so in around 2012, they had a Kickstarter, and they founded a physical makerspace that was a membership-based model. And as they continued to do that for about a year, they realized that they didn't want just their kids to have access to this. They wanted all of the kids to have access to it. And in the meantime, some of the people from LAPL came to take workshops there because they were beginning to gear up to have full steam ahead at the branches. And so the opportunity for a partnership, became available. And so we started working with LAPL, and then we also started working with County. And the mission of the organization is to spread the maker learning style to as many kids, youth, and adults as possible. So what's this maker learning style? Well, first thing, question is, who is a maker? Who can call themselves a maker? And the answer to that is really, sincerely, everybody, because making is not just about technology. Making is also about cooking, crafting, all kinds of things. It's really anything that we can create rather than consume. That's the value, to remind ourselves that we can do that. So usually when I do this in real life, I ask everyone to go around the room and talk about something that they like to make. And so we hear a lot of different things. We do hear, cooking and arts and crafts and stuff, but something that I always like to draw attention to is that we also hear things like making music or storytelling. And in fact, for myself, my background is in filmmaking. So it's important to realize, that looking at our world as made objects, like in storytelling, it's going to encourage you to think more critically about the media that you see if you realize somebody made this. They had a goal for it, just like anything else that you make. Okay, and then why are we so excited about maker learning as a learning style? It's because we believe that it does more than teach you STEAM skills. It also teaches you a method of learning that you can apply throughout life, including to your academics, but also just to various problems that come up. We like to say that every problem is an engineering problem. It can be attacked in exactly the same manner, and we'll talk exactly about how that is. Okay, so about this training, it will utilize a lot of the techniques that we're teaching. So keep your eyes peeled for modeling, reflection, troubleshooting, challenging received cultural beliefs, and fun. Okay, so what is maker learning and why is it important? Well, there's about 5 steps I'm going to talk about. And step 1 is that you choose a project that you want to make. Maker learning is interest-driven. It's intrinsically motivated. And a side note, even though in many of our workshops we're all going to be making the same project, we are very careful to structure it so that there's a certain part that goes by instructions, but then it moves into a design challenge where you're just thinking about the goal of the project and you'd find your own way of getting there. So why is a practice where intrinsic motivation is foregrounded something that's important? Well, here's a cultural challenge. It's because that the way that our brain is made, learning and problem solving and satisfying your curiosity and things like that are all things that are naturally rewarding to us in our reward system. Like we know that our brain works to give us dopamine when we do something that's oriented towards survival, like eat a meal or something like that. So the thing about it is that in our culture, we don't define or see learning that way. We see it as something that you do at school or you do it for work. We don't view it as a recreational fun time activity. So by doing maker stuff, we're kind of able to reconnect to that natural enjoyment of these types of things. And that can be really helpful to us because it'll make us more open to doing them in all the times that we need to do them. Okay, so the second one, and this one is very I think easy for librarians, is that maker learning foregrounds information finding. The first step in a maker project, whether you're doing it for fun or also at work if you're an engineer, is you look at what others have made. You want to find what are the existing best practices. You want to start where like the world has left off, and have the benefit of everything others have done. And the culture challenge here is we can't, in grown-up life, spend time reinventing the wheel. In the way that our school system is set up, and this refers to kind of our educational, I think, problems, and not necessarily to what actual teachers believe and do. But, the traditional method is you have to do everything from scratch. You're not supposed to copy something, etc. But if you do that in the workplace, and at least, I use the example of my brother, he's a coder, but I think it's true for most people, is that if he's given a task to achieve and he doesn't cut and paste the best available existing code for that task, he's going to be in trouble because he's wasting time that he should be spending on innovating and by doing what he's the most talented at. So another kind of cultural challenge that making underlines is, and I use another example from computer science because I think that there's a big stereotype that computer science, like coding, is something you do in a basement all by yourself and da-da-da. But there's actually a technique called pair programming where people put literally two people together on one computer and they write the code together. And they find that when they do it that way, they get the code faster and it has less errors. Okay, so the third step of maker learning is, and this is, we're getting into the meat of the problem solving process, it's breaking down the problem. And we call that computational thinking. And again, a lot of computer stuff in this, but it's a set of problem solving skills that were derived from computer science but can be applied to everything. So the key aspects of computational thinking are decomposition, which means breaking things down into parts or steps, and sequencing, putting the parts in the right order to achieve the goal. And so the example that I use to illustrate this is actually a language arts exercise for kindergartners. And this demonstrates to us what we know, which is that sequencing is very important even in language. Like language doesn't work unless you sequence it right for whatever language you're speaking. And also that the ability to do these things doesn't always, it doesn't come naturally. It's a skill that you develop over time and, you can always improve your skill for this. And that brings us to a concept of metacognition, which we believe that making is particularly useful to develop your ability at. So I like to use this quote from Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching to define metacognition, which is metacognition is thinking about one's thinking. It refers to the processes used to plan, monitor, and assess one's understanding and performance. Metacognition includes a critical awareness of your thinking and learning, and also of yourself as a thinker and a learner. So, I think the classical, simple example of this is, you crammed all night for your test, you didn't get a good grade, and you're able to look back and reflect that, maybe the method that I used to learn was a problem, as opposed to maybe thinking like, well, I'm dumb, that's it. But it's like, no, can you take that extra step and go, well, could I actually have done something differently? And do I need to be taking more notes? Or, like just the idea like that you're aware and conscious of your own thinking and how you're operating. And so metacognition is a fundamental value in maker education, as is demonstrated in this quote from Dale Doherty, who is the founder of Make Magazine, which is where a lot of this maker kind of culture and self-definition as a community came from. And so he said, it's metacognitive skills that we're trying to develop, a way of thinking, a way of doing that increases your confidence in your own abilities and in your capacity to learn. I'd like students to believe that anybody can do these things, not that only a few people are good at math or only a few people are good at programming. So then this is a really cool part of it, which is that the attitude towards the concept of failure is that failure is, unfortunately we use the same word for you failed, you're terrible, you got an F, it goes on your permanent record. And then in engineering, you use the word failure for the thing didn't work. And that's like every try is an experiment and you're trying to get data about how is it going to work? Like, how can I make my next try better because I've identified what the problems were the last time? So if you want to think about that in kind of regular terms, if you have the ability to try again repeatedly until you get to the goal, that's called resilience. And so a little quote about every try being an experiment is from Adam Savage from Mythbusters. And he said, in the spirit of science, there's really no such thing as a failed experiment. Any test that yields valid data is a valid test. And frankly, the explanation that is the best of this is given to us by Will Smith. And I will just play this video. If Will Smith says it, obviously it's true, and I don't think it's a better way to explain that. Okay, so the fifth and the last step is that when you get the result that you wanted to get, rather than something that's only validated by others, like a teacher or a parent, then that translates to the trait of confidence, right? Because what's confidence other than if you want to do something, believing that you can actually do it? So we've talked about maker learning styles and we've talked about who are makers, but what about the space part, right? Like this organization's called LA Makerspace. Well, we define a makerspace as anywhere that makers gather to share tools and information. So if you have like a pair of knitting needles and your grandma and people that want to learn, you're in a makerspace at that time. It's not the equipment that determines the learning, the experience does. So we designed our maker workshops to function as the messing around phase of something called Homago. Some people might have heard of this book. It's a book called Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out that comes out of MIT. And one of our board members, Becky Hare-Stephenson, is one of the co-authors on this. And it is basically an anthropological study of how teens learned in one of the first library makerspaces, which is the Digital Media Lab in Chicago. And so they observed that the learning pretty much always took the same format, which was first, the teens would just hang out in the space because they make it attractive. Like you could talk, you could eat, your friends were there was some event that brought you in. And then because people in that environment were doing stuff, or like making videos in this case or what have you, they found that the teens would start to mess around. They would do something very low stakes that was new to them, like, oh, maybe I'll just make a 30-second video off my phone or whatever. And then they found that if that connected with the teen, they discovered that they enjoyed it, then you geek out. You teach yourself everything you need to know, and you put in the practice to get great at it. You look at all the YouTube videos and you read all the books in the library, and you just put in the 10,000 hours or whatever, and that's all driven by you tried something out in a non-scary way and you found that you enjoyed it. So here is where, if we were in person, I would be doing a reflection, which I think, the goal would be to do this reflection together when you guys get together. And so I would be asking people to reflect on these concepts that we just learned of intrinsic motivation, information finding, computational thinking, collaboration, failure, confidence, and Homago, and ask them to think about an instance in their life that relates to one of these concepts. Like, did you see this in action? Did you see something that felt like it disproved it? Stuff like that. So, I guess you could pause and maybe take some notes about that and then talk about it tomorrow or whenever. Maybe that could be a way to do it. Okay, so let's talk about some different principles behind learning, sort of like a little bit of learning science, I guess you would say. So the first thing to think about really is that what is the most primitive, primal and basic way for humans to learn? It's by imitation, right? Like every baby learns by imitation. So if you think about it, if you are learning in sort of a, again, this sort of conventional received structure where you learn from someone in authority, what are you observing about the process of learning? What is the model that you can create from that about how learning happens? Well, what you're going to see is that there's somebody that knows everything and somebody that knows nothing. And then the first one tells the second one everything and then gives them a test. So that's not something you can apply yourself when you want to learn something else. But if you're learning something and there's, an adult or a helper there who's willing to say, I don't know, but these are the steps that I take to find out, then the child can imitate that model the next time that they want to learn something. So, as we like to realize, librarians are already experts in the key technique of maker learning, which is the ability to say, I don't know, but I know how to find out. And I think the very tiny leap that, people don't necessarily see it this way, but easily could, is that skills are a type of information. We don't think of it that way. We think of it as something that experts have or something really special, but it's just a type of information. So you guys already know how to help people find that. And then there's something particularly useful about doing this in libraries, because libraries are a third space where it is actually safe to try things out and to fail at stuff. Like, everybody knows their librarian only as somebody that's there to help them, not somebody that's there to judge them or whatever. And even when you do this in schools, which is great, and you should, and I hope we're doing it more and more, there's always going to be a little bit on the back of your mind that this is my teacher that's seeing the outcome of my project, who's going to grade me later in English class or whatever. So there's always, that little bit of tension to it that you don't have to have in a library. Okay, so then another important principle to know about learning is something very simple, which is reinforcement. We all know what positive reinforcement is. If you want to learn more about it, I love this book called Don't Shoot the Dog, which was by the person who like invented clicker training essentially, and she was a dolphin trainer in the early years of that. And she really makes the point that the brain works by, if it gets something positive, it does that behavior again, including your own brain, including everybody's brain. And you can use this technique on yourself or on anyone else, but it's the easiest way for someone to learn or change their behavior. So if you can be the person that gives that reinforcement to another person, you can really help them grow something that they're trying to grow in themselves. And so, it's a good point, a good time to point out that basically all the techniques that we're learning are completely natural, but we're learning to recognize them and to use them intentionally, and then we can use them as tools. So, maker learning gives many opportunities for reinforcement, and so be watching for those. Okay, so now I do another time of talking to the class, which is asking us to look at our whole presence in this maker learning techniques workshop as an engineering problem and start with the outputs that we want to get. Like, what are our own intrinsic motivations and wishes for this process of gaining a skill set as maker librarians? So just like in the 5 steps of maker learning we talked about, I encourage people to think about, why are you here? Why are you listening to this video? Why are you taking this seminar? Why are you going to be doing this stuff in your branch? Like, what is it that you want someone to either experience in the moment at their maker workshop, or like long-term changes that you would want them to be benefited by? So I guess this is another time to pause and maybe write down some stuff for tomorrow and can discuss it then. So then I go on to talk about, when, we at LA Makerspace asked ourselves this question, what did we think of? So the first thing is to know about is a concept called mindset, which is based in this book that was very popular in the business productivity community. And it's a very simple concept, which basically is that there's 2 ways that people think about how learning happens. And one of them is a fixed mindset, where they believe that your abilities are innate and they're determined by your talents. And another one that's a growth mindset, where you believe abilities develop with work and practice. And a really interesting illustration of this is actually a study that was done about praising kids. And they found out that, but depending on the way that you praise them, you're either kind of reinforcing one thing or another, which is that if you praise them for being smart, you're making them afraid to prove that wrong. Like, I think a lot of us are familiar with the imposter syndrome or whatever, but it's like, I'm supposed to be smart. What if I do this and I screw up, and then everybody's going to see I'm not really smart? And then, that can make you very unencouraged to try. But if you praise a kid for the effort that they put in, and you say, that's great, you got that result, I see you worked really hard, then you're actually giving them a variable they can control. They feel like they do have power over how well their things turn out, and that there's something they can do to impact it. Not just like, am I the right level of smart to do this? Maybe I'm not, So we tweaked that idea of a growth mindset, and we kind of were like, well, what is this specific for makers? So I developed some I statements of what we would want people to believe about themselves as a result of their experiences with making. So these are: I believe in my ability to figure things out, even if they seem hard or unfamiliar, and that's confidence. If something doesn't work, I can comfortably keep trying until it does, even if I feel temporarily frustrated. So that's failure tolerance and frustration tolerance. We're going to talk about that more specifically later. I'm not scared to risk doing things a new way or creating something I haven't seen before. And that's confidence again, because you really can't have too much confidence. Or, you could if it was groundless, but you can't have anyway. I'm not embarrassed to collaborate with others when I'm running into trouble or just to make my project better. Collaboration. And learning new things and solving problems is fun for me because I am awesome. And that refers to restoring that, consciousness of the natural reward of this kind of behavior. And another reflection, it's where I would ask people to think about your own maker mindset. If you would like to grow some elements of your own maker mindset, what are those? How might you do that? If you did find that you developed some of these as you went through life, what's the story of how you accomplished that? We could all learn from that. So I guess looking at the recap of the I statements, or actually, if we're doing it on video, we could just look there because people were saying it was too small. So you can, pause on that and write down some thoughts on that topic, and then we can move on to Maker facilitation tools, which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And actually, I'm going to stop the recording right now and start a new one because I don't want it to be too big of a file and lose it, and that would suck. So pause. Okay, Maker facilitation tools. What's the beginning? The beginning is priming. And people may be familiar with this psychology term of priming. And basically, it just means that the expectations that you come in with really influence your experience of something. So the classical experiment is you take two identical bottles of wine and you put a price tag on one of $5 and you put a price tag on the other one of $100. And guess which one everybody gives the great reviews to. And so in the context of these workshops, we really thought about how to set the stage for the experience so that the participants will get the most out of it and use that principle of priming. So if you want to give somebody to get a mindset, or if you want to get a mindset yourself, I think it's pretty clear and established that identity is the shortcut to that mindset. And this is based on an incredible study called the Batman Effect, which I love, which was that they wanted to see what factors would influence how long 4-year-olds could concentrate for. So one of the things they tried is they told the 4-year-olds to pretend that they were Batman. And they found that when they did that, they could concentrate like 2 to 3 times longer than the other methods. And I could be completely misquoting that, but it was statistically significant. Because if you're Batman, Batman obviously has great concentration skills because he invented all of those tools and weapons himself. So if you're Batman, obviously you can concentrate really well. So what I think this reveals is that, a lot of these traits, we have them in us. We have the ability for all of them because our brain has as many connections as a galaxy or something like that. But our identity are which of those traits do we associate with ourselves? So we figured if you can adopt an identity that has these traits that you then demonstrate, you kind of have to also believe that your regular identity has them too. So how do we, practically speaking, work with this? Well, we created an imagination exercise that we are beginning to start all of our workshops with. And this is a visualization that uses an imaginary identity to engage some of the intrinsic motivations, the ideas of perseverance, and increase your creativity and problem solving. And so the first step is you pass out all the supplies and then have the participants put their heads down on the desk and tell them that now they're roboticists, coders, engineers, artists, etc. And so then you remind them of the goal of the project. So the example we like to use is you want to make a robot that makes art. And then you ask them to picture themselves in their lab and they're surrounded by all their previous amazing robots that they've created. And they start to work on their art robot. And what would that be like? What would what would it use to make art? Would it use paints, or would it use pencils, or would it use lasers, or what does it look like? Does it have a bunch of tentacles? Is it big? Is it small? And so when they finish with that, you ask them to open their eyes back up and say that we're going to marriage that with the supplies that we see in front of us, and we're going to use these supplies to design a robot that makes art. And so you'll notice that I have Bitdefender. And you will also notice that in this exercise, we used an identity that's already familiar, like scientist or like an engineer or whatever like that. We don't say maker because maker is not something people know about or have a pre-existing idea of. So they're not going to have an identity with a mindset to pull from. But as they do maker activities, then that's how they develop that identity as a maker. A lot of people ask, should we show them an example? And the answer is no. If you show examples or focus on following instructions, it can limit the creativity of the designs. Like these are art bots. This is, like usually you see a cup with 4 marker legs, but when we didn't show examples and asked them to focus on how they would do it, in their own imagination first, this is what we got. Okay, so the middle portion is the actual troubleshooting tools themselves. What are the specific techniques, what to say, when to say it, etc., in order to execute this kind of maker learning? Okay, so the first thing to know is that by the time somebody says that they need your help, they're feeling a lot of emotions usually. and they may be feeling emotional overwhelm to the point that their mental resources aren't available to solve the problems because their emotions are too high. And so we know that the ability to regulate your emotions is a skill that develops over time, and particularly a younger kid is not going to have a lot of ability to do that. So the first step when we help somebody problem solve is we're going to want to, help them, if they need it, to regulate their overwhelming emotions so they can focus. And so what are the emotions we might be seeing when people ask for help? We would see frustration, as we've mentioned before. And what is frustration really? It's anger. I'm angry at myself because I couldn't do this, but I might also be, I might be projecting that and be like, I'm angry at the materials, I'm angry at the project, blah, blah. And you might find someone that's wanting to give up, which usually underneath is shame. I'm ashamed that I failed at this. I should have been able to do it. And now I feel like I'm lesser and I'm afraid to try again. So how do we help them? Well, the first step I would say is to recognize and accept what's going on with them. I like to use a definition of empathy from Carl Rogers, who is the founder of humanistic psychology, which got developed into an educational technique called learner-centered teaching. And his definition of empathy was, you are a confident companion to the person in their inner world. And I thought that was great because empathy is a word that we hear a lot, but we don't have a clear, shared meaning for it, and we certainly can't operationalize it at this point. So it seems like if you're trying to help someone, the first step would be establish yourself in that role as the confident companion to the person in their inner world. So you're going to let them know two things, and this can be nonverbal. We'll talk about exactly how. And the first thing is that you recognize their experience. You don't just see that they have a broken project. You see that they're a human being experiencing a fully fledged moment, including emotions, and that you accept that experience meaning that you're conveying that you having a problem doesn't make me angry. It doesn't make me think less of you. And then that's actually a moment of modeling, where you're showing them that because you don't respond to them that way, they don't have to respond to themselves that way when they quote unquote fail. And it's also an opportunity to model how to respond to failure like it's no big deal. Back to Will Smith. Okay, so what are some concrete techniques we can utilize to do that? Well, the first one that I'd like to talk about is emotional contagion. And this refers to the fact that human beings tend to adjust their emotions to each other. And there's kind of a logical reason for this if you think about it, because let's say I ran into the room and I'm like screaming and freaking out and running. You should run away and not wait to see if there actually is a bear. You should run away based on my emotions. And that's because we can use each other's emotions as data. So our bodies are very set up to communicate our emotions to each other. And this is something called autonomic mimicry, which means that we're always sending out these extremely below subconscious signals about our emotional state. These would be things like pupil dilation, flush on your cheeks, breathing rate, heart rate, things like that. And whoever's kind of got the stronger signals going out, then the other person's going to adjust to that emotion. So if you're conscious of this, you can do it on purpose and you can help someone change how they feel, such as becoming calmer, by kind of making your emotional signals more intentional, such as quieting your tone or slowing down your own breathing. And you can even do this with an entire class. You can use it as crowd control. There's a kind of behavioral contagion as well, which is that he did, like Sandra Milgram, he's the guy from the Stanford, no, not the Stanford Prison Experiment, but the one where everybody electrocuted each other. So he did a famous experiment where he had some people stand on a corner and look up and point, and a huge, crowd gathers and starts looking up and pointing. So if the class is rowdy, instead of trying to be louder than them to be heard, something you can do is walk around the tables, which we always suggest set it up in a U shape so it's easier to do that, and talking to individuals, asking them for quiet, asking them for concentration for the class, and using that emotional contagion. But you're going to notice that the other participants pick up on what you're doing and they begin to do it too. So they kind of get deputized to settle down, and that quieter tone is going to spread naturally. Okay, so let's talk about some language things or things you're specifically going to hear and what to say in response. So you're going to hear a lot of, I can't do it. And if you hear that, you're going to want to respond with things like, that's normal because this is new for you. Nobody can do new things well until they practice, because it's very easy for us all to think that we're special and unique and everybody else can do it on the first try and we're the only ones that suck. But obviously that's false. You can also say the first time is always the hardest. It will get easier from now on. So you're kind of, pointing out that, the overwhelming emotions you feel right now, that's the worst it's going to be all day, and it's going to only get better from there. And it's also good to share your personal experience. Like, it was hard for me when I first learned something. If you hear, "Can you do it for me?" which we hear a lot. People are like, particularly the kids these days or whatever, are feeling very passive and like they need a lot of, permission to do stuff. So here's where you don't want to say, "I can't," even though that's a completely normal thing, thing that might come up to say, and you don't mean, anything by it other than that you're, that's not how you're going to proceed. But, this subconsciously is going to be taken a different way than you might intend, because the participant's aware that that's not a fact. Like, you could help them. So subconsciously, it's received the same way as if you told them a lie on purpose, and if you were withholding help for either, you're mean or the person doesn't deserve any help or whatever. So what you can do is take this little like language inflection point to say, let's work on it together instead, because that way you're not misrepresenting your abilities, but you're also not saying shift for yourself or whatever like that. Sometimes, however, you really can't for practical reasons, like there's 20 kids that are all asking for your help at once. So even actually, if you can, you shouldn't, if you could use this technique instead, which is encouraging them to help each other, because that's an opportunity to reinforce information finding, collaborating, and not reinventing the wheel. So there's a specific technique how to do that effectively, because, just telling each other, just like, go ask somebody or whatever, that's not what we're trying to do. We would say, ask the participant to compare their project to one that is already working and look for the difference. So this relates back to the computational thinking technique of decomposition, breaking things down into parts, which we'll talk about more later. But what you want them to do is literally go part by part, side by side, because once you find the place where they're different, you likely found where you're going wrong. And then a librarian just gave me the tip one time that if you use the word friend, sort of another like language thing, and remind them they can leave their seat, then it will help them to collaborate. So if that's not an option, because definitely always try them helping each other first, way better than you helping them. Then you would want to walk them through the troubleshooting thought process. And this is what is especially cool, I feel like, because every time you repeat this, it engraves this process into your brain. There's a truism in neuroscience that neurons that fire together wire together. And so once you have that habit really ingrained in you, when you hit a problem in other areas, you just sort of naturally snap into it. Like, you don't have that initial emotional response. Just go, all right, well, let's break it down. So this is a really great thing you can give to people. All right, so the first step of I'm actually going to pause here and make the file smaller. Okay, so the first step in the troubleshooting process is observation. You're going to want to start by saying, let's look at how this is working. And you have them try to make it work again, and you both look closely. Language inflection point, this is not the same as saying, show me what's going wrong, which is another thing we might instinctively say. That wording has the effect of communicating that the solution to the problem is me. If you show me, then it's going to get fixed. So you're missing the opportunity to reinforce that the first step in problem solving is to look closely, which you can always do on your own, even if nobody's there to help. Step 2 is this decompensation, breaking things down. So you're going to want to ask them to describe what they see happening, how the parts are working together. Looking at the parts instead of the whole is an important part of computational thinking, and it doesn't always come naturally, even for adults, because especially for adults, there's a tendency to jump to conclusions that, oh, I have a problem because I followed the instructions wrong. So then what you're doing is you're comparing your memory of the instructions to your memory of what you did, and that is never going to help you fix anything. You got to look at what's right there and actually in front of you, because you might not have done something wrong at all. Your paperclip might have fallen off. Anyway, so then step 2 for decompensation is ask them to say, what do you notice about how that's working once they've described it? And so you're probably going to start to see what's going wrong with the project before the participant does. So if they don't seem to be noticing, what you can do is you can help them narrow their attention to just the area right around the problem and ask them to describe what they see again, ask them to decompose just that area. And if they still don't notice, that's when you can start to ask them questions that are relevant about the background information that we talked about at the beginning. For example, with this, idea of this art bot project, we're maybe troubleshooting if the wire isn't touching the battery. Is the circuit still a circle? If the circuit's not a circle, then what happens? And can the little electrons get all the way through? So then once they think of an approach that they want to take to solving this problem, once it's identified, if we were engineers, we would call that an iteration every time you try. And so for the first iteration, it's going to include sequencing steps and other design engineering skills. And you might hear the participant say to you, can I do X, this thing, or will this thing work? And that is an opportunity to say the magic words of, I don't know, let's try it and see. Because again, people ask for permission a lot and they want to turn to others as authorities, which is fine, but we can sort of, help them get freed off of that. Okay. So then continuing iterations. Two things might happen. Number one, it doesn't work. So that's fine. Again, modeling how we respond to that. And then ask the participant to start the troubleshooting process again at look closely. Let them know you're going to come back to check on them and just let them continue on their own. And then, if they ask you to come back, go back. If you notice they seem very discouraged, go back. And also, it's important to note that sometimes you're just going to have to do something for somebody. Like this is not to be inflexible here. Like some kids are just not going to have the motor skills to tape the marker back on or whatever. So, this is just judiciously when you see that there's an opportunity to do it, then you can do it. So then the other thing that might happen when they do their try is it works. Awesome. This is a very awesome opportunity to reinforce that the participant just made it work themselves. This again is like getting into that sort of identity or reinforce, like drawing their attention to like, look, you have these traits. You can look closely. You try things out. You persist. You use what you learned from your try. And it's also an opportunity to reinforce or draw attention to the fact that people enjoy problem solving by giving them that feedback, by, reinforce it by sharing your enthusiasm with them. Showing off is a huge part of maker culture and natural human motivation. Like I remember myself, like the first time I did Artbot, I really noticed how I just had this instant instinct the minute I made something work to go, look. And, this is the whole reason we have maker fairs. It's like everybody wanted to get together and show each other their cool robots because that's naturally reinforcing. Okay. So the end of the workshop, after we've finished completing our projects, we want to do a reflection. We'll finally talk some more about why we've been doing that this whole time. So reflection is reinforcement. It reinforces the process that you used to solve your problems. It reinforces your identity. What traits did you show yourself that you have? And it reinforces noticing what you enjoy and communicating that your enjoyment of it isn't trivial. It's not like, oh, fun is dumb or whatever. It's like that's your fuel to geek out, to learn more. So we have put together some suggested reflection questions, which are available in your co-facilitation guide. And these questions are adapted from a metacognition curriculum from an organization called Teach Thought, and we adapted them for making. So what did you learn from making your project? Pretty simple question. That would reinforce metacognition, going back and observing the process that they used to learn. Are you happy with how it turned out? And will you keep working on it at home? And that reinforces intrinsic motivation. Remember, you did this because you wanted to. And participants often really do want to work on it more when they go home and they ask for more supplies or whatever. What was the most fun part of making your project? Saying this like a broken record, but notice where you felt reward. Utilize that. What problems did you have while you were working on your project and how did you solve them? Metacognition. What is your project's name and tell us its story? This is not always appropriate for every project, like, coding it might not be, but let's say you built a robot or you made a superhero mask. What superhero? And so that's a part of maker identity where it's just reinforcing that your imagination is as valuable as your skills. It's not just about the skills and the technical results. It's your just flight of imagination is what's going to end up with, helping you innovate. What do you want people to notice about your project? Again, that's that, dopamine hit of showing off, imaginarily showing off, be like, these are the things that I'm proud of. Did you help someone else with their project or did someone help you? Reinforcing collaboration. And it also reinforces a little bit similar to the next one, which is what are some ways you could share what you learned with your family or friends? And if you only asked one reflection question, this would be the one I would wish you would ask, because it reinforces something incredibly important about maker identity, which is that we are all both learners and we can help others learn. I am not just a student and you are not just a teacher, and vice versa. Okay, so that is our presentation. If you would like to geek out about making, a good place to go is Instructables, which has billions of projects, and we have our own channel that you can look at and see some things that we've shared. Always trying to add more. And you can also go to a Maker Fair, which, as we know, LAPL has brought that to downtown LA. Will be December 1st this year. And they also have a listing of Maker Fairs all over the globe on that website. All right, go make stuff. You can learn more at lamakerspace.org. We actually do have some more writing about maker education theory. And if you have questions or feedback, please contact me, Maya Stark, and have an excellent rest of your class.